Well, hello and welcome to the Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint live series. My name is Guy Stevens. I'm the founder and executive director of the Alliance Against Seclusion and Restraint. Also, the host for the podcast here. So I get to do lots of fun things. And want to welcome you. Thank you for joining us today and tell you a little bit about who we are. If you're not familiar with the Alliance, we are a small Maryland-based nonprofit, but we work across the country. Our work really began around the issue of restraint and seclusion in schools around the nation, but it's much more than that. It's not just restraint and seclusion. We also look at issues around suspension, expulsion, corporal punishment, more broadly kind of punitive and exclusionary discipline, and even more broadly than that, it's really about all the things that are often done to kids in the name of behavior. Often kids who are chronically misunderstood, leading to poor outcomes. So I started this work really because of a personal journey with my son. And our work is really out there to try to make a positive difference, trying to support parents and educators and others who are trying to bring better practices and policies into our school to better support kids. And at any rate, we've got a special episode today. So many of you know we are here every 2 weeks, but lately we've been here a little bit more frequently because we've had other things to talk about. So our regular schedule is every 2 weeks, but then when something exciting happens, I'm like, well, let's do another episode. So we do a lot of special episodes, often because there's something out there in the world that suddenly is available that we want people to know about. And today is no exception to that. Today we are here to talk about a brand new book from Dr. Destiny Huff. It's called Neuroaffirming Advocacy, a neuroaffirming guide to special education services. So I'm going to introduce Dr. Huff here in just a moment. And I'm really excited to have her here to talk about this book because it's a really valuable tool for families. Before we do, just want to remind you that we do these events live, and of course we do them live, but you can go back later and watch it or listen to it elsewhere. We make these available live on Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube. If you want to watch it after the fact, go to YouTube. That's the best place to watch it. We also make an audio-only version available if you want to listen to it as a podcast. So you can go to Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you get podcasts, and you can get it there as well. So with that, I just want to take one more note, and then I'm going to bring up Dr. Huff, and we will get started with our conversation we're going to be having today. And that is, if you are watching live right now, and I know there's some people already watching live, welcome. It's great to have you here. I know we have a lot of people that come week after week and join us for the podcast. So it's great to have familiar names and faces. I can see them here in the comments. And if you're brand new here, welcome to you as well. Great to have you here. We're a community that really is working to try to make positive change. And I would encourage you in the chat, let us know who you are and where you're from, because it's always fun to see who people are, where they're joining us from. So take a moment in the comment section and let us know who you are and where you're from. And I encourage you also share this. So if you find it a valuable conversation, share this with your friends, your colleagues, and help us spread the word and good ideas. So let me go ahead now and bring up here on the stage here with me, the virtual stage, Dr. Destiny Huff. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about Dr. Huff here. Dr. Destiny Huff, LPC, is an autistic and ADHD therapist, special education advocate, author, and parent of 2 neurodivergent learners. She supports families and professionals in developing neuroaffirming, strengths-based practices that center access, autonomy, regulation, and meaningful participation. Through consulting, training, and advocacy, Dr. Huff works to challenge ableism and create more inclusive educational and mental health systems. Dr. Huff, welcome. It's great to have you here today. And I feel like it's, I've had the privilege of knowing you for a bit of time. In fact, we were both serving on the board of PDA North America and got a chance to get to know you. You presented for a past event we did as well, the Beyond Behaviorism Conference. I've long been a fan of your work. Today, I love keeping an eye on your social media, and I feel like you stop me in my tracks sometimes with like words of wisdom. I'm like, yeah, I love what I'm hearing. So welcome, and thanks so much for being here today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. Yeah, and then you're presenting at my conference in the spring, so we just keep staying connected and collaborating.
I love collaborating. Love since I started doing this work, and for me, as you know, it kind of started with my own son and our own journey. But since I started this, and it was probably late 2018, early 2019 when I started the Alliance, I've had the privilege to get to meet so many people that are doing so much incredible work, and I love to see people collaborating and working together, and so it's really important to me that we have these opportunities. So I really appreciate having you here today, and of course, we're here because at some point on your social media feed, I saw this and I thought, "Oh, look, a new book," and I have bookshelves full of books. Um,
Uh-huh.
and some of which I've yet to get to, but something pops out at me, and I'm like, oh, that looks like something I need to take a look at. And of course, in the spirit of trying to support friends and colleagues doing this work, I thought, hey, maybe you can join me on the podcast and we can talk a little bit about your new book. So the new book, of course, is a neuroaffirming guide to special education services, neuroaffirming advocacy, and this is it. And of course, you and I were just talking before the show. I like hard copies, and you had this previously in a different edition as a digital only. Now, of course, it's available as a digital and a hard copy as well. So it's great to see it out in the world. So welcome and thank you so much, and really again appreciate you being here. And I'm excited to talk about the book.
Thank you for having me. Yeah, I did. I had a digital copy, and people kept saying, "Are you going to make a physical copy?" And I was like, "I'm getting there." And I'm glad I waited till this one because I learned so much from the first edition I created. So
Mm.
this one, I really was excited to get a physical copy of it going.
Yeah, yeah, and it's substantial too. I mean, and it's big for old people like me. That it's like I don't have to feel like okay, where are the reading glasses here? But there's so much in here. So let's start with the backstory of this, and I know from talking to you a bit, and also just kind of knowing a bit about your work, that sometimes things like this come from a place of our own journey. So why don't you tell me a little bit about how this started to come to life in the first place? What inspired you to write a neuroaffirming advocacy guide?
Yeah, so I think if my parents at all are watching, they they would say like she had to write something because I was in school for years, and they were just like, "You're always learning. You always love to learn," and I always wanted to teach. And my mother's an educator, and she was like, don't teach. And she was like, she told me now that it was just because she was like, I think I wasn't making a lot of money at the time because she's been teaching since I was before I entered school. And so I've always enjoyed writing. I've always been a writer in my mind. But as you and I had discussed, I wasn't in the advocacy disability space until about 2022. And my son entered into kindergarten. He was one of the post-COVID babies that was in daycare at the time, and we had a horrendous year, his kindergarten year, in the state of Louisiana, and he was secluded and restrained. Just a very traumatic year, and so I became an advocate and did all the research, and I noticed as I was learning from my friend Lisa Baskin Wright about neuroaffirming practices, I was like, this really fits. And then I read an article by Kay Braun Johnson, who is out of Canada. And I was like, yes, this is what I've been using words around, but didn't have the language for. And so I went full steam ahead in that. Subsequently, my son was diagnosed. I was diagnosed. But I always, like I told you, I don't like to reinvent the wheel. And so I really was like, okay, is this already out here? And I came across ironically, after my first edition, I think there was a book that came out that was like Neuroaffirming Education. Like it was specifically for like educators and implementation in school. But again, there wasn't anything I saw that was specifically neuroaffirming special education. That was a book that educators, advocates, parents, everyone could get a hold of and collectively have conversations, dialogue, and practical tips to implement. And so I started taking everything I had been learning, everything I had been implementing, and I was like, I'm going to write this book. And during the first iteration of it, I sought out professionals I respected and was like, hey, and I was like giving them a portion, basically, give me your feedback. So I sought out a psychologist, a school psychologist, and I was like, am I accurately describing, this piece? And then for the second iteration, because I had spoken with an educator, a psychologist, an OT, and SLP, I had the opportunity this go around to kind of just send like the goals to somebody I trusted and was like, okay, I've updated this now. Is this reflective? I added motor planning. So that's really where it was born out of, was I was like, I'm always looking for resources, gathering resources. And I was like, I don't feel like in the space there is a lot of that neuroaffirming piece that we're accessing now. Since I wrote the first edition, obviously neuroaffirming has become a buzzword like trauma informed, right? So
yeah, I hear neuroaffirming appended to things that it should never be appended to. I mean, there are certain things that by nature are not neuroaffirming, and it's like, and same thing with trauma informed. I mean, you can't have a trauma informed restraint practice, right? I mean, it's not, those two things do not go together. But you're right. But your work is legitimately, neuroaffirming, work. You mentioned kind of in the beginning, kind of your son story, and you became an advocate. I'm just kind of curious, when you say you became an advocate, are you initially talking about an advocate for your own child, or did you from there go off to helping other people advocate for their children? I mean, obviously at some point you're on a much bigger scale with this, but when you started, was it just your own advocacy journey?
So I actually started them at the same time, advocating for my son and advocating for others. And so
interesting. Okay.
To add to that piece, I would say by trade, I'm a mental health therapist. That is my background. I'm a certified trauma therapist for children and adolescents. So I was always in the space of working with children, supporting children. And then I was in the schools as a mental health professional. I've done foster care. I've done the juvenile justice system, supporting children as a therapist because my husband's military. And so I've done the gambit. And then during the time that I got an advocate on the base, so through the EFMP program, Exceptional Family Member Program for military, when your child receives their diagnosis, it's specifically autism, they have a medical provider and they have an educational provider, so to speak. And they're there to support you in navigating what services you can access medically and any support you need educationally. And so the educational one was the advocate that attended a few of our behavior intervention plan meetings, got things going, rolling, helped us get at least an IEP because we were leaving. I was like, I don't care if it's crap or not, just get us one. We got that. And she said, you can be an advocate. Like, she's like, you have background, you have knowledge, you have all these things. She's like, you can do it. So we moved. And then I always laugh now. Me and my husband went to my son's school. This is his first grade year. And we told him straight up, like, look, it's not your fault. You didn't cause the trauma. You didn't cause the issues. But this is going to make or break his access to public education. And so at the same time, I was researching and throwing myself into special education law, advocacy, out all these things. And then that's when somebody who I met in a network was like, I have this parent that needs support and I can't take them on. Would you take them on? And I was like, I'm going to start this business because I started working from home. I had always been a therapist, but I had a private practice on the side. I made it full time because I needed to be accessible for my child. And my husband couldn't because full-time active duty military. And so that's how I started that. And actually my first client, it was a manifestation hearing where they found him. They determined it wasn't a manifestation and they came to me then. And then I drafted and reviewed and gave the parent everything to appeal it, and they did get it appealed. So that was actually my first advocacy case to come out the gate.
Yeah. Wow. I asked that question about kind of like, did you start kind of advocating for your own child or it's interesting that those things kind of emerged at the same time. I think back to our story and my son had an IEP in pre-K and then in kindergarten, and initially was primarily around, speech and pragmatic language goals.
Mhm.
But, we knew in pre-K and kindergarten, like there were some challenges there. He did really well in small groups, but in larger groups had some difficulty. And he had done really well. And I'll be honest with you, like in the beginning, like an IEP was just like a thing, right? Oh, he has an IEP. Okay. They're going to provide him. We weren't really actively involved. I mean, we went to the meetings, but we were like, okay, well, here's what the professionals are saying, and here's what we should be doing. And the end of kindergarten, they said, well, he doesn't really have much, he's done so well, and he really doesn't need all these other supports. And we think we can pretty much get rid of everything other than speech. He was going to go into a general education setting for first grade, and all we had was speech. And, at the time we just shook our heads. Oh, that sounds great. Okay, he doesn't need these other things. We got into first grade. It was a nightmare. I mean, he had supports that had been working previously that were, we got rid of them. And of course, the fact that something's working is a sign that we might want to keep it. But at the time, we weren't really terribly involved. We were just like, oh, okay, this is something the school does. And here are all the professionals. And when
Right.
first grade hit and we began to really have some difficulty, at that point, I realized this is not the same role that I thought it was. Like I actually need to understand these things a little bit more. And I began to like take a deep dive into IDEA, the federal law, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. I found the books from Pete Wright, the Wright Laws books about kind of education to advocacy. So I had a very deep dive pretty quickly into trying to understand all these things. And it's interesting because what I started finding was that the things I was being told didn't really necessarily align with law and my
Mhm.
understanding of the intent of IP. So very quickly, with a little bit of education, I started saying, well, gee, this isn't really working the way it should. And then I went deep, and then I thought, okay, this kid here, my son is my job, and I need to figure out what I can do to appropriately advocate for him. But the truth is, it's not easy, and there's a big learning curve to understanding what you need to advocate for your child. And I think that often parents, again, I don't like the word compliance, and I'm not one much for authority either, but we often as humans tend to
Uh-huh.
defer to people with expertise without questioning it. And I don't believe that, by the way. I think it's really important to question things. But at any rate, I was struck by, wow, there's a lot to this. This is not simple. And, I think a lot of parents and families, again, you get into this process and you don't think you need an advocate. You don't think you need an attorney. You think that everybody's got the best intentions of your child in mind. And truth be told, without advocacy, often a child won't get what they need.
Mhm.
Has that been your experience as well?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think what you're saying is just so spot on to most parents' experiences, and I get hired um, from parents that are at the top of the quote unquote food chain for their profession
Mm,
because they're just like, I don't have the energy and capacity. They're like to dive into this, and I need someone else, especially when I'm getting upset and I'm trying to maintain
right.
my professionalism because I am a professional and I don't want to seem some kind of way. And they're like, but they are taking me there because there's certain things I just know are not correct. And I think what you're speaking to is just so valid in that you trust the professional, and that's what we're taught. We're taught to trust the
Right.
professional, right? You don't have their education, you don't have their experience, you don't have their background knowledge. So you should trust what they're saying. And what I found is that's all good and well and valid if their training and their
Hmm. Hmm.
education is where it should be. And a
Right.
lot of times I'm coming in and I'm correcting special ed directors
Hmm. Hmm.
who superintendents are defaulting to because they're not even accurately quoting or interpreting their own state law.
Yeah. Yeah. Or federal law for that matter as well.
Yeah.
I remember at some point in my journey, because once I started on this and realized like I have this really important job to do in advocating for my son and to make sure that he gets the things that he needs, I need to really take a deep dive into this. And I also learned very early on that it was important for me, and this is not easy, and this is why advocates are I think so important, but it was important for me to be able to separate my emotions and my feelings from being able to articulate a case and kind of show the evidence for something in a way that helps to get where we're going, and that's not easy. And often, when parents are advocating, and again, I mean, there's even, kind of racial undertones here as well, the way they are perceived and the way, I mean, there's a lot of issues here when your goal is just to do right by your child. We see a lot of complicated things begin to happen when you're trying to advocate for your child. And we can come back to that, but I was just going to mention that at one point, I had the opportunity to take some training through our parent training center in the state. And parent training centers, I think, can be a great resources. I mean, they vary a lot from state to state, but they can be really fantastic resources. They were offering a program called Leaders, and it was really focused on a pretty high level of training around federal law and IEPs and navigating the system. I want to say it was about an 80-hour program in person. And I remember when I finished that training, learned a lot. I mean, learned a lot about the law, learned a lot about, SMART goals, how to advocate, really felt like well prepared to continue the journey that I was on. And I remember asking a question. I'm like, hey, this training that we just did, do the people at the school that sit around the IEP table, do they take training like this? Do they have some kind of training like this? The answer was no, they don't. They're not required to have an in-depth training like what we had. And that shocked me. I mean, that many times those that are sitting around the table, and the problem is that, that sometimes people begin to believe things that aren't true. And I don't know that they're always necessarily, trying to intentionally mislead you, but, I heard so many things that were not true. And I'm like, wait a second, that's not really what federal law says. So it's a really tough place. And I guess all that to say that, advocating for your child, one, is I think one of the most important jobs that you have, but two, it can be really difficult, and you may need help, and there's different levels of help. Level one is, making an investment in yourself, in understanding like what the process is. And what I love about your book is that, I mean, I'll be honest with you, like the whole idea of advocating and federal, like that seems all really scary, but you've created a book here that really helps to lead people through this journey. Like, and it leads people through the journey in a very thoughtful way. Because one of the things and the reason this exists, and you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but the reason this exists is that, IEPs, of course, are federal law. And it would be wonderful to think that all IEP teams are actually creating IEPs that are in fact neuroaffirming. But in my experience, that is not the rule at all.
No.
That is probably a rare exception. Many things in IEPs are not at all neuroaffirming. And so you've actually brought these things together to say, okay, well, if you're supporting, a neurodivergent learner, not only do you need an IEP, but you need to make sure that it is rooted in neuroaffirming practices. So what I love about what you've done here is you really kind of tried to simplify that process for a parent. So, again, step one here, if you're in a position right now where you're trying to advocate for your child and you're frustrated because it seems like this is not easy to understand, this is something that they can put their hands on and really get started in the journey. So why don't you talk to me a little bit about the book? And you've got kind of 4 chapters here, and then you've got this really rich section of resources. So chapter 1 is kind of well, you've initially got an introduction, of course, kind of introducing what you're going to be doing, but chapter 1 kind of gets into the foundations of neuroaffirming practice. And why don't you talk a minute, if you would, about and we know why an IEP is important, right? Because we want to make sure that if we have a child with a disability, that they have the accommodations, the supports, the plan to help them be successful. But why don't you talk to me a little bit about kind of this foundation that you're laying and why neuroaffirming practice is critical to this?
Yeah.
Uh-oh, sorry, we lost you for 1 second. This is a big book, and I put it down on my mouse apparently and clicked you off. So I apologize about that.
No worries. Yeah, one of the things is that I think there's so much about special education out there. There's so much about advocacy out there. And now there's a lot about neuroaffirming practices, and merging those two and the importance of them is so important to me. We know the US based school system is very compliance based. And so, like I said, I had always worked with children. There were things that always, like being a mental health professional, working with children kind of rubbed me wrong here and there. And when I learned about neuroaffirming practices, I was like, wow, this is actually saying like what I've been saying for years, which is that people are children. Children are people too. And so what it does is it adds that extra layer of disabled children are people too. They are entitled to autonomy. You ask if they need help. You don't just assume that they need help. And it really forces, like, one of my favorite parts of it are the resource section, are the list of organizations and individuals that you can follow, because it really dives into that. But in chapter 1, there's such a
by the way, I just had to show this off here because I'm really proud of it. But if you go to the organizations, because we start with an A, we're listed at the top. So when I saw that, it you know.
Oh, I was for sure like, when I don't know if I even had a resource section like that in my first edition. I did, I think, but it was shorter. And I made a point this time of like really going and pulling organizations and things like that. But yeah, you guys, top of the list, like being against seclusion and restraint makes you neuroaffirming off the gate, because you're saying like they should have bodily autonomy. So, but yeah, with chapter 1, I really wanted to make sure that it was like, okay, these are kind of the pieces from neuroaffirming. This is the history of neuroaffirming. This is what that actually means, putting that into practice. And one of the bases that I used for kind of those tenets that you see, like 1, 2, 3, 4, was K. Braun Johnson's article, which was also kind of made from that history of neuroaffirming practices, and then also dives into the lived experience educator and their neurodivergent umbrella. But it gets into the fact that there are some actual core tenets. And whenever I do trainings on neuroaffirming practices, that's what I say. I'm like, somebody says they're neuroaffirming and they can't tell you, like they say, like, that's my thing, that's what I do, I'm a neuroaffirming advocate, I'm a neuroaffirming educator, whatever, and they can't tell you the tenets of being neuroaffirming, for me, that's an immediate red flag. So I wanted to put in that first chapter, like, this is the basis, this is where you start, and then we get into the actual IEP itself, and like, what does it actually look like to bring these tenets throughout the entire special education process.
Yeah. And, you know, I think for, you know, and this is a continual process of learning and, you know, trying to figure out, you know, how to do better, I guess. But, you know, when I think about kind of this journey, and, you know, I think about, you know, my experience with IEPs, and many of the families that we've worked with over the years as well, many IEPs are not even close to neuroaffirming. You know, many IEPs are, you know, I mean, I would say very heavily rooted in like the medical model perspective of disability, right? So it's looking through that lens of deficit disorder. You know, it's not looking at, you know, how do we remove barriers? How do we support people? And, you know, I mean, again, I always think back to my son's you know, IEP, and at one point, and I've shared this story before, but, you know, he had a goal about eye contact. Why on earth did we need a goal about eye contact? You know, that's something that was actually physically uncomfortable for him. Why on earth would we steer in that direction? So, you know, the fact that you need an IEP is one thing, but, you know, again, you know, if we're talking about a neurodivergent learner, we really do need to figure out how do we best support them in their authentic selves, right? So that idea of being neuroaffirming is really a pretty big shift for education. And it would be nice to think that, oh, well, we're there, right? I mean, neuroaffirming, it's a buzzword now, so schools must be there. But yeah, tell me about it. I mean, we're not even close, right, in terms of, you know, what we see out there. Yeah. What are some of the things that you commonly see or you have seen throughout your work in supporting families and working through the process yourself, of things that really, you know, you see as red flags that aren't neuroaffirming, that really show that there's a sign, an issue?
Yeah, so I think from the start, a lot of people really want to believe that we still don't have eye contact goals in IEPs. And I had one removed in January.
Right.
from an IEP. So
It's like the clip charts, right? I want to think those clip charts are out there like in fossil records. And occasionally I get somebody's like, oh yeah, we have a clip chart. I'm like, those are still really out there? It's shocking.
And that's what I did a training on with your conference was
Yeah,
like
yep.
about clip charts and reward systems, because I had an early introduction to that with my own son, and him like not understanding that I didn't clip up, not because I did anything, but because everyone doesn't get to clip up.
Mm-hmm.
But also everyone has the ability to clip down. So I'm confused, right? So
Right,
and that's the thing when we're talking about like being neuroaffirming. But eye contact is one I still see ones about eliminating stimming. I still see
which serves a regulatory function, right? So
right.
So we're to stop people from doing something that helps them to actually regulate.
Exactly. And I still see a lot of goals just around controlling the disabled individual. I mean, really, that's what it all comes back to. And I think it goes back to what you were saying about the medical model and deficit based. A lot of times when I come into meetings and I tell everyone, I do my introduction the way I do my introduction when I'm in these meetings, so that they know all of the hats I wear and all of the experience I bring into the meeting. So my introduction is, I'm Dr. Destiny Huff. I'm late diagnosed autistic ADHD. I'm the family's advocate. I'm also a mental health therapist. Why I do that is because it lets them know, like, I'm in this space for multiple things. And as I go on to explain, like, let's say have conversations with the person that's representing mental health in the room. I've worked in the schools. Like I throw these things out there. I have a learner that has a 1-to-1. I say these things because it allows them to get a better understanding that I'm talking from personal and professional. And so, but it's really a lot about, still going back to that medical model deficit base, it's really a lot about the thought process that is still carried over from many years ago, which is that the goal is they need this IEP because there's something wrong with them.
Right.
And we're going to fix it, and they're no longer going to need this IEP. And we'll know we're successful if they don't need the IEP. And it's a very outdated view and thinking, because it doesn't acknowledge that the whole point of an IEP is for accessing education. When we go back to why IDEA, why IEPs, why 504s, it was because parents of disabled individuals said, my kid deserves access.
Right.
And somewhere we lost that and thought, okay, we'll give them access, but in order for them to get access, they have to respond and do things a certain way.
Yeah. So often, I mean, the goals are wrong. And I say goals are wrong. I'm not talking about IEP goals per se, but the overarching goals, right? I mean, one of my big beefs is like compliance. Compliance is the wrong goal. You don't want, your goal for your child is not that they grow up and learn to be compliant. My goal for my children is not that they learn to grow up and be compliant, but sometimes that is the goal. And you see it woven in through the fabric of something like an IEP. So often our goals are wrong. And I think that's the important backdrop of this idea of a neuroaffirming IEP, is that we want to create something that sees and values individual differences and supports them. And is built around, supporting a human being, not controlling or, you were saying a minute ago, and I love this. I always love that idea of like shifting, like autonomy is really critical. How do we shift away from power over dynamics? It's not about doing something to someone or doing something, but for someone, but how do we do things with the kids that we're supporting? And it's a big shift. It's a big shift for a lot of people. But I think, this book, again, critical help for a parent working through this process, a parent of a neurodivergent child, one, to begin with this foundation, because neuroaffirming practice is not something you bolt on an IEP when it's done. It should be built into the workflow, the ideology. So let's dive a little bit more into that. You get into chapter 2, and you help people to kind of understand special education law and your rights. And tell me, why is that important? Why is it important for a parent to understand special education law? What are the parts of special education law that you think are really critical for parents to understand as well?
Yeah, I gotta say that was the easiest yet toughest chapter to put together, because special education law is so critical, and there's so many components. And especially the more I've done this work, the more I have seen where parents rely on the school, understandably, to educate them in that regard, and it's missing. And so it's so important for you to know your rights and your child's rights. That's ultimately what you're stepping up against, because, and I say this all the time, I started out as that parent because I have family members that are educators being like verbally requesting things or having phone calls about things and not having the documentation subsequently. And so then realizing when I get in a meeting, they're like, I don't remember that conversation. And I'm like, what? Right? So I think looking at special education law and looking at IDEA, some of the big ones that always stick out to me are, one, prior written notice. I always tell my parents that you need to know what a PWN is. Like it means that, if a decision is proposed or refused, there should be documentation about it. They should say what they're going to do instead if they're not going to do it. And they should say who you can contact if you disagree. So that's one of the biggest ones that I find myself explaining probably on a monthly basis, during consults, when I'm, talking to new parents, when I'm doing trainings where they're like, what is that? The other one is child find. So understanding that, these districts are under obligation to identify disabled learners and provide testing and support. And what I'll find is a lot of districts still in 2026 are getting away with going, well, once they have a medical diagnosis, come back to me. And I'm like,
wow.
Yeah, you don't medically diagnose, so I don't know why you would even be opening that door, which is the other thing that I like to throw.
Well, and sometimes they disregard the medical diagnoses.
Right, because and that's what I say. I say, like, you don't get to pick and choose. And I've had to say that in IEP meetings. Like, are you using the medical model and medical diagnosis, or are you doing category and eligibility? Which one are you doing? Because you told the parent this, and now you're on this. So it's just...
Well, and that gets confusing for parents too. I mean, I've met many a parent who said, well, the school diagnosed my child is autistic. And I'm like, the school doesn't diagnose. The school can qualify for services as, but yeah, I mean, that gets confusing. And then of course, I can't tell you how many times, I've seen schools push back on diagnoses as well.
As I learned too in the United States, because I had made a post about this, where in the United States, school psychologists do not diagnose, they categorize. That's what I call it categorizing and determining eligibility. But let's say Canada, it is considered a diagnosis. So that was something I had learned new when I had made a post. And somebody had said, well, in Canada, it does count for the same thing. And I thought that was interesting. And that's also when I learned about my reach, because I was just thinking about
that is interesting.
US, these United States was all I was thinking about. And I was like, okay, learned something new. But yeah, a lot of parents don't. And I'll have parents where when I go to review documentation and things like that, as an advocate that sits at IEP tables and meetings, I'll tell my parents, let me get a copy of the neuropsych or the psychological where they're formally diagnosed. And that's when a lot of times they were never diagnosed. It's outside of the school. And I'm like, well, the school doesn't diagnose. So then we have to have that conversation of what that means.
Yeah. So, I mean, I absolutely agree with you. I mean, I think that, having some foundational understanding of the laws that are in place can be really helpful. Understanding, free and appropriate public education and things like least restrictive environment and some of those terms that get thrown around in the meeting. And again, when you begin to understand those independently, you can begin to question or pushback is needed, but sometimes there's great power in questioning. Sometimes the one of the things that you can do that holds the most power in an IEP team meeting is continue to ask questions until you kind of get answers that really explain things. So I think that foundation in understanding, you get into chapter 2 and what's the difference between an IEP and a 504? That's really important as well. So that foundation that you lay is really important. But then we get into chapter 3, where you talk about understanding the evaluation process and your rights. So talk to me a little bit about kind of the evaluation process and the rights that you talk about in chapter 3.
Yeah, I found that a lot of parents, again, just like you're saying, they don't know what the evaluation process can look like. They don't know that their state has a specific timeline. They don't know there's a federal timeline. Interestingly enough, I see where a lot of my parents that kind of get shafted, so to speak, when it comes to evaluations are school staff.
Yeah.
Because it's like, you get it. We're overworked and there's a wait list and we're this and we're that. And so that's when they usually go seek out an advocate, because they're like, this is what parents have been talking about. We're like, I can't even get you to evaluate my child, but you want to call me and write home and suspend and all these things. So I was like, let's talk about the evaluation process. Let's talk about, I have a resource in the back about the different types of assessments that can be done. Let's talk about what makes an assessment process neuroaffirming, because, you know, there's so many high maskers. There's so many minimally speaking, unreliably speaking learners that use AAC, and there's not presumed competence. So there's this importance too of addressing that there's a wrong way to do an evaluation process. There is a wrong way to evaluate a disabled learner, even though you're checking the boxes, quote unquote, with the tools that you're using.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, I mean, again, just knowing what your rights are there, knowing that you might be able to ask for independent educational evaluation, you know, knowing the things that you have the option to do. And I think, you know, one of the really important things in my mind about this whole process, and curious on your thoughts, but is just really empowering parents and you know, caregivers with the idea that you are an equal member of that team, and you are the one consistent member of that team that's going to be with that child throughout their academic career. You know, you bring a lot to the table. You know, I think it's really easy sometimes to sit in that room with, you know, 6 people with lots of letters after their name and feel a little bit overwhelmed and a little bit like, oh, well, gosh, you know, I guess I'm just here to, I mean, I've heard parents say, well, this is what they decided. I'm like, whoa. No. There's no they. You are part of that group. So if you don't agree, you know, but it's hard. I mean, you know, I mean, it involves, you know, kind of making persuasive arguments, sometimes being a little, you know, pushing back a little bit. You know, that's really hard as well. What's your advice to parents in terms of that, in terms of really kind of understanding their important role, and subsequently, you know, if they do need to tap out, if they do need to hire an advocate, for instance?
Yeah. So one of the things I always tell my families is that you're the only consistent IEP team member, right? Even if your child somehow manages to have the same case manager or the same principal for all 3, 4, 5 years of, you know, whichever area, primary, secondary school, like, you're the only consistent member. And so I've had to get into IEP meetings and say the same thing. Nobody has been at this table longer than mom, than dad, right? Then grandma, then aunt. No, you haven't. And so while you're telling me this is going to be different, or this is going to be like this, or whatever, this is the person that has seen it all, that has seen the trial and error, that has seen things benefit, not go well. And I tell parents that's where you have to own your own confidence. I was telling my husband, I'm not a fan of expert or expertise, because I found a lot of individuals that use expert and expertise in their titles or roles are not always open to learning. Right, and so, you know, but, you know, as the parent, you know your child, you've been through their education, you've seen what's worked and what hasn't worked. And so you have to own that when you go in there. And then as far as knowing when to kind of seek extra support, I tell my families, like, when you're just like, you know what, I need someone else to say this. I need someone else to be there. I need someone else to write this. I get hired by a lot of families because they're like, I don't even need you to attend the meeting, Dr. Huff, but I cannot draft one more letter, one more input statement, one more this, one more that. I need someone to just talk it out with, draft it. I'll send it, go in there and vouch for it. And then I'm sometimes like, I can't write it nor go in there and say it. So it's just the different levels of like, where do you need that support at?
Yeah. No, I hear you. So I want to get to chapter 4, which is really, I think, one of the most exciting parts of the book, because we get into the building blocks of neuroaffirming IEPs. Before I do, if you're watching live, if you have a question or a comment for Dr. Huff, feel free to put that in the comments or the chat. and we'll try to get to a couple of questions if we can as well. Chapter 4, though, is the building blocks of a neuro-affirming IP. And I think this is why people are here, right? They want to know, how do I shift from just a typical IEP to a neuro-affirming IP? Tell me about some of the highlights. And of course, our ultimate goal is we want you to get the book so you can learn all of the wisdom that's here. But what are some of the highlights here? What are some of the things that you think are really critical to building a neuro-affirming IEP?
One of the biggest pieces was the parent input statement. That was the piece that, and I'm sure you saw this and probably experienced this, with your son, in that a lot of times as parents, it's just like, hey, Ms. Huff, what are you concerned about? What are Destiny's strengths? What are this? What are that? They take it, they put it in a few sentences, and that's my parent input statement.
Right.
And I was just like, I would talk to parents and they're like, well, I want them to know this is how they regulate, this is how they communicate. I was thinking to myself, I want you to know all the things that we're doing outside of this to support my child. Like just because it always, as a parent, it always feels like there's a little bit of like, but what are you doing to address the quote unquote behavior? What are you doing? Like, how are you trying to help? And so over years, it has developed. And the last iteration of me making a parent input statement is what ended up in this book, where I was like, as a parent, address all the things. Hi, Sarah. I know, Sarah. Address all the things. Like, how do they communicate? How do they regulate? What is their executive functioning? How do they communicate? And you see there's just like excitement in my voice because I love giving that input. And when I sometimes tell my parents, they're like, oh, well, I didn't even know. Or I'll have parents that draft a huge parent input statement that is unfortunately very repetitive and not hitting on those key things they want the school to know, because they're like, there's so much I want them to know. And so that was one of my favorite parts, was really putting in there like, okay, this is how you can do these paragraphs. These are the things that you can address. And it was because I was like, that's a cornerstone of setting up the IEP, because a lot of times parent input in every state's IEP document is different, right? Some states there have an actual parent input section. A lot of times parent input is going to be tied to your present levels. And present levels is the foundation for the entire IEP. That is what goals, services, accommodations is built off of. And so by having it there and having it as a part of that, you are influencing whether or not they are addressing or not addressing these needs from a neuroaffirming standpoint. So that was one of my favorite pieces of chapter 4 to highlight. And then the breakdown of, I mentioned sensory, I mentioned executive functioning, I mentioned communication. I also have breakdowns of those in that chapter as well, as far as like, how do you honor that from a neuroaffirming standpoint? So that would be why chapter 4 was pretty special and kind of the real root of it.
Yeah. I mean, and I love, again, the idea of the parent input statement. And again, this is part of the IEP that you have significant influence over what goes in there. I remember kind of in the, somewhat early days of some of this work with my son in the IEP world. I remember I had made at one point kind of what I call a backgrounder, and it just kind of coming from the press background. It was like a backgrounder, it's like a one pager that tells you a little bit about kind of like this thing. And in this case, the backgrounder was about my son, and it was, a couple of pictures. It was who he was, what he liked, what he didn't like. What did he look like if he was having a hard time? What might you do if he was feeling, becoming dysregulated? And I had a very simple one pager I could give to people. And over time, I had this much longer version as well, which was like, but that one pager was really valuable because it was something you could give to people. And I had several teams that I work with that were like, this is really, really helpful. But to again, get that important content into the IEP is critical. And I love the guidance you gave on helping people to create those. You, of course, in that section then go into things about, developing SMART goals, let's rephrase this, SMART and neuro-affirming IEP goals. Why don't you talk to me a little bit about what that means? What do you mean by SMART and neuro-affirming IEP goals? And of course, we put that against the backdrop of the fact that a lot of IEP goals are not at all neuroaffirming, right?
Right, right.
Okay.
Yeah, no, because I think so. One of the things I always say is like I've been writing goals for almost 20 years. I like in mental health, I wrote goals.
You started when you were 5?
I am not. I was young. But that was the goals was always my first go-to when I really dug into neuroaffirming. Like, so I started looking, are they smart? So are they specific, measurable, attainable, or achievable, realistic, or timely? SMART, the acronym, it basically means, do you know what's happening? Do you know what's being measured? Is it actually achievable for this learner? Is it realistic? And is there a timetable for when we're going to revisit this goal? And I think there was a shift over the past 5-10 years. And that really, they were like, yeah, we're making SMART goals. So we have a lot of SMART goals. Yes, I have it right there in the book.
And it's beautiful and colorful too. So.
Yeah. And I wanted it to stand out like, hey, this is how, what each one means. And I, break that down. But then what I started to see was, okay, the goal is SMART. Great. Not neuroaffirming. Like, we're looking from a compliance lens. We're trying to make this learner neurotypical. Which means, we're trying to make them not neurodivergent. We're trying to make them less disabled. Right. And so in that section, I think that was one of the sections I really poured over a lot, because I was like, I do a lot of trainings on SMART and neuroaffirming goals. I get asked a lot to do trainings like that. And I wanted to really make sure I got my thought process, for better lack of words, on paper. So a parent could go, an advocate could go, or an educator could go, okay, let me look. That is not what this goal looks like. Right. And so, it's really just about honoring, like you had mentioned earlier, that autonomy, that self-advocacy, honoring the fact that they are competent and they are capable, and not just making it where I see a lot of goals, especially for my learners. And I like to say I see two sides. If the learner is minimally speaking, unreliably speaking, non-speaking, I will see where they're not presuming competence. And so it's almost like we're still teaching them the same things at 10 years old that we were teaching them at 5 years old, because we don't think that they've grasped it. And I'm like, then there's a problem with how you're teaching, because why have they not grasped it 5 years later? And then for my learners that are more verbal, that have more mouth, words, and communication, a lot of times you'll see where there's that dysregulation piece, which is labor behavior, right? And so a lot of their goals will basically be about, like, I need you to sit down for 10 minutes. I need you to stay on task for this amount of time. Disregarding executive functioning, disregarding sensory needs, disregarding regulation needs. So that's why I'm an example person. And so that's why I also make sure to put in there, like, this is SMART and this is neuroaffirming. This is an example of a goal I have seen, will see someone's writing right now. And this is how you make this more neuroaffirming. And then in the resources, I have actual neuroaffirming goals in there that you can kind of pull from and tweak for your learner.
Yeah, no, I love that. And we're going to get to the resources here in a minute, because that is really a rich section. And, I remember, and, I don't think that there were probably as many good examples a number of years ago, but, I remember even as I was kind of learning more about the IEP process and advocating, and, kind of thinking about goals that were more aligned with the principles that I thought were important, looking for like sample, and it was really hard to find good information. And of course, at that point, I would say, a couple of years back, you weren't finding neuroaffirming goals. You were finding just, better, what they thought were more typical non-neuroaffirming goals.
Right.
So it's been a journey, but I love the fact that as we get into this appendix, that there are a lot of good resources there. And of course, you get into talking about modifications, and you talk about accommodations. One of the other things that I noticed was kind of a little primer on FBAs and BIPs as well. And I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit. What's the best way I can put it? Have a lot of concern around the typical FBA and BIP, meaning that just the whole process by which FBAs are created. And I'm all about being curious around behavior. I'm all about trying to get to what's going on. But we look at it through a very limited lens in terms of the functions of behavior. And in my experience, very often it's okay, we're going to do a functional behavioral assessment, and we're going to, do some observations, and then we're going to assign the behavior a function, and then we're going to come up with an adult hypothesis, and then we're going to come up with a reward of some kind to put into a behavior plan. Without fail, I've been asking this question in presentations for a couple of years now. And without fail, I go to audiences with parents, with educators, with others, and I ask a question, says, who here has a child they love or support that has had a functional behavioral assessment and had a behavior intervention plan developed? And I see lots of hands go up. And the follow-up question is, who here has a child they love or support that has a behavior intervention plan that works really well? And you know how many hands go up? None. None. Now, I'm sure there's a room I could get to where I could find people that have great behavior intervention plans, but often what we're doing are not working. And I would say that, neuroaffirming behavior intervention plans are probably even rarer than neuroaffirming IEP goals. So talk to me a little bit about that. Talk to me a little bit about, BIPs and FBAs and what that looks like through a neuroaffirming lens.
Yeah. So I knew when writing this book, I wanted that to be in there. I was like, because my oldest son is on a behavior intervention plan. It has worked.
Good. I'll come to your school and I'll ask that question. So I'll be like, did Dr. Huff create that plan?
But because of what you're saying, because
right.
I spearheaded, and it actually started with when he was receiving his diagnosis, and they wrote the first one in Louisiana. And I was just like, this can't be what this is supposed to be. It was just a consequence plan. Mm-hmm. That's all it was.
Reward or consequence.
Yeah, it was like if he doesn't do this by this many prompts, like we're gonna do this, we're gonna do that. I remember what struck me, not even knowing about behavior intervention plans at the time or anything like that, was that he was 5 years old, and one of the things he was gonna do if he didn't follow through with what they said was he was gonna write an apology letter. And I remember going, write an apology letter. I was like, he's learning to write. Like, what are we talking about? And I remember the psychologist was like, absolutely not. She was like, it was an educational psychologist. And she was like, this is a consequence plan. They're teaching him no skills. They are doing nothing but saying, you're signing this telling us we have the right to do X, Y, and Z if he doesn't do X, Y, and Z. That really spearheaded the lens at which I looked through behavior plans. And so one of the things that I always say is, one, I like an FBA and a BIP if there's dysregulation, because it tells me what you think about the learner. Mm-hmm. It gives me an idea of what the school thinks about the learner. It gives me an idea of their perception of the learner. One of the things I talked about was how there's the basic 4 functions of behavior, and how there's a neuroaffirming way to look at that. But in the book, I go into how I say multiple times, though, to your credit, Guy, and what you're saying, that like, this is me giving you an understanding of an FBA and a BIP, because you're going to probably come across it. And you're going to come up where there's going to be conversations. But there are ways to make it neuroaffirming. And that goes back to what it really should be, is a regulation plan. What it really should be is a communication plan.
Support plan. I mean, yeah,
exactly. And so instead of that, it often becomes very consequence-based, and it becomes like, if they're going to do this or we're going to do this. And so what I do to make them more neuroaffirming is I have conversations around, well, it sounds like you're saying this is what's going to happen, but what is the skill? Right. What are we trying to teach? What is that going to look like? What is the approach going to be? Once you start getting them to talk, and I even had one where the school did like their perception on one side, the parents' perception on the other side. And then we had a consensus of what we were going to keep or not. Like, we had to create a Google Doc because we were in such disagreement with the language, with the approach, but they were trying to be accommodating and collaborating. And so ultimately
that could turn into quite a monster.
Yeah. And so it ended up being a thing where it was like, we were doing certain things and this or that and doing all this. And this isn't my son's, this is a family I support, but we got a consensus for a plan. And we got it where, even for my own son's plan, I'll use that as an example. So like, one of the things I don't like attention seeking is connection seeking.
Yeah.
I always say, even if you have a learner that is doing jokes and flips for their friends, they're trying to connect with their friends, or their classmates or their peers. And so what we did was we did the like 4 functions, I don't know, evaluation or whatever for my son, the tool. And I had to put in his IEP that because of the scoring based on said function, it's identified from this assessment using this language. However, the team has discussed that we believe that it's this and this language. I had to put in his IEP because I was like, I need you to understand, like, this is sensory connected, communication connected, regulation connected. We're not going to go around labeling my Black son as XYZ. So that's the approach I use, is that I like it as a window into what does the school think, what is their perception, because a lot of subjectivity comes out in FBA's events.
Yeah. Well, you know, the other thing that so many of them are missing is the focus is completely on the child and not on the adults. And you know, a good behavior intervention plan talks about what adults are going to do differently, right? I mean, this is not just about the child. This is about supporting someone, supporting another human being. And, you know, so often it's just a matter of like deficit, reward, consequence, and repeat. And those plans don't work. I mean, they don't work. I'm flipped open the book, and I've got another section here where you say some things that just really resonate with me. I mean, you have these six principles here. You know, get curious about the behavior, prioritize regulation over compliance. That one gets a big one from me. Understand neurotype differences, respect autonomy and agency. You know, shift from fixing to supporting, individualized supports. You know, a lot of wisdom in this book. And of course, a good portion of the book is actually resources. You've got this appendix here with a resource section that has really, I think, some really rich resources. And, you know, sometimes it's hard to go from like, okay, well, there's some great tips and knowledge here to how do I apply this? And what you've done here in this book is you've provided sample letters and templates and goals. And, you know, you've got a whole section on neuroaffirming goals. You know, so if you're thinking like, okay, I get it, I want to be neuroaffirming, but what's it really look like? Well, we turn to page 172, and there's a lot of different options here in terms of neuroaffirming goals, kind of broken into categories here. So, you know, you've got a section on, you know, related services and, you know, even things like, you know, big versus small problem, and, you know, lots of really great things here. How to check ableism. This is fantastic. And I feel like I've seen this maybe, or a form of this through your social media before as well.
Yeah.
Lot of great resources here. How to look at disability and race, you know, the impacts of discipline, you know, just a lot of things here. And again, you know, templates, you know, a template for a letter, you know, what does that look like? This is really actionable because, you know, again, when when you feel like everything is mounting on you and pressure, and you're trying to advocate, sometimes you need to get to the tools. You need to get to the, okay, well, how do I do this? What does it look like? And this part of the book, you know, I really thought was so valuable. Tell me about some of the resources here that you think have been really helpful to families that you've worked with.
Yeah, I think one, you know, you've mentioned several of them. I think, you know, from an educator standpoint, the educators, the neuroaffirming goal one is I think that in accommodations is gold. If you're writing the IEPs, like, how do I actually make this actionable? These are things that I've put in IEPs. I've had put in IEPs, that friends have put in IEPs that are neuroaffirming, that school districts have been like, yep, let's go. From the parents, I wanted to make sure there was like templates, but also related services in there, because a lot of parents don't know what related services are. When I use that term, I'm like, oh, do they have related services? They're like, what is that? And their child might have speech, OT, and PT. And they're like, oh, I didn't know that. And I don't put that on the parent. I put that on the school team. Like, you should be explaining to them that, like, this is what that's called, so they can have that understanding. The ableism one that I put in there, the race and disability one that I put in there, the names of the organizations and individuals to follow that I put at the end. I think that's so important because those are individuals that I have, you know, either worked with or been fans of their work, where I feel like it's really representative, because I don't know everything. And I think that's the thing people have a hard time saying. I don't know everything.
But it's hard for me to say Dr. Huff doesn't know everything, because I've been following your work for a while, and I think you know a lot. So I mean,
no,
I know
and
I have a lot to learn, but
and I get that a lot too. And I'm like,
Yeah.
I'm not a speech, so I'm not an OT, right? But
Sure.
it's like, so I put all these resources, like, and but I think the resource section, you're right, like it came from, I put a lot of stuff on my social media. And I think like my second year of doing my social media, somebody was like, you need to write a book. And so when I went to look for resources, I went to really go, okay, what is my social media content I've been putting out there? What is reflective of where I'm at now? And I like started grabbing all that together and tweaking and editing and, how do I make this more actionable and how do I pull this together? And I did that because sometimes you just need it in one space. And so I was just like, I think this is the bulk, instead of like, I'm always big on don't reinvent the wheel. Right. And I do so much social media content that I was like, let's grab that and tweak that and make it more informative, or add in, like I'd get questions or comments that I'm like, let me tweak it now because they did ask that, and add that to it and then add it into the book. So I'm really proud of the resource section, and I'm really big on like, you want to have actionable items and tools. And so that's the piece that I'm really, again, proud of the whole book, but really felt like you could just, okay, I need goals. Go to that.
And that's the thing. Like, if you don't have time to read the whole book right away, start with where you need to start. Go to the appendix, find some goals, and come back to that. I also love, your focus on strengths-based language, I think, is really important as well. And you've got this great section here where you have kind of deficit-based language and alternatives and strength-based language. And I think it's a really useful way. Again, I've always loved the quote from Stuart Schenker. I use it a lot. It's the see a child differently, you see a different child. Right. When we begin to shift our language, we see kids differently. When we see kids differently, we respond to kids differently. When we respond to kids differently, they respond to us differently. Like we affect the whole cycle there. But you've got great things here. You've got like, okay, well, avoids demands, needs collaborative approaches, or may not have the capacity when, and kind of insert situation. You've got manipulative behavior, like, impulsive, kind of change that to fast acting, or again, how do we use language and really emphasize what the strengths are? And so many of our neurodivergent learners do have some really unique strengths that can be fostered and really help them in the long run to really be successful. So I think it's really critical. So at any rate, we're reaching about the end of our time here. Actually, I think I promised you it would be a little less time. So we're going to wrap up here in a moment. But again, just wanted to point out all the rich content here. You have a section on related services and talk about, sometimes, parents might not even know, like, what are the kinds of services that might be, I remember one of the things I pushed for early on, and I think I taught my team about, because I don't think they knew, was I was pushing for educational services for us, the family, which is something we absolutely could do. And the people are like, well, I don't know that we can do that. Oh, absolutely you can.
There's a whole section in the IEP for that. And
right.
Yeah, that's
what do OTs and PTs do? Lots of great stuff here. So again, want to recommend to people, if you are, a parent, and quite frankly, even if you're an educator, like, I want to see more educators thinking about neuroaffirming, IEPs as well. So whether you're a parent, whether you're an educator, if you're someone that works with and supports a child with an IEP, this is a fantastic book. We put the link in several times for you to order it. You can get a digital download that you can probably get right away. You can get a bundle as well that comes with the printed version and the digital. We were talking earlier, and sometimes it's nice to have that digital that you can quickly search. But definitely something that you want to check out, and we'll share that link again. We do have a question here before we wrap up, and this is from Sarah. And Sarah, great to have you here today. The question that is most often asked to me from the school is, how can we implement these approaches when there are other students with different needs or different plans? And I'll respond with one thing, and then I'll let you get to your response. The question makes me a little angry. It's like, that's the whole heart of this. IEP, individual education plan. That means we need to be implementing plans and approaches for all the other students that might have support plans like this. But, we do hear a lot of pushback. We do hear, what about the other kids, or that wouldn't be fair, or if we're doing this for one child. So you tell me, what are your thoughts here?
I've had that question, and I literally say, how is this not supporting the other kids?
Right.
Because at the end of the day, it goes to that foundational piece, right? So if they're considered a quote unquote behavior issue, right, then that means that there's a lot of dysregulation. So them being regulated benefits everyone, right? So we're saying, how do we help this learner be regulated? And that's one of the things I put in a lot of when I make my content. I'll point out, if they're regulated, then there's no longer safety concerns or issues for them, their peers, or the educator, right? So for me, one of the things I frequently find myself having conversations about is like, tell me why this is an issue. Tell me what this looks like in the classroom. Tell me why you feel like this can't be implemented. When you start asking those questions and you start to get wheels turning, you're going to often find that, and I found this a lot, where unless you have an educator that's really digging in their heels, because a lot of times I'm seeing it's not the educator, it's someone above them, that they will be like, well, shoot, if it's going to decrease my stress, let's do it. Right. So I open that door of just like, tell me why you're finding it hard to implement this. Tell me why it seems like this is an impossible ask. That's where I lead with, because in the end, we know that, even going back to like another buzzword, inclusivity and inclusion, that, you know, if you're doing that the right way, then everybody is having access. Everyone is supported, including the staff. So I push back on it from that standpoint of just like, and I pose it basically as, tell me why you feel like this is difficult to implement. Tell me why you feel where the struggle is, and let's problem solve that together. Collaborative problem solving.
Well, yeah, it's funny you say that, because I was thinking about collaborative problem solving. This idea that, you know, the things that you can do that may benefit the child that needs a little more help and support, these same things can benefit all the children in that setting. You know, collaborative problem solving is a good example about, you know, that when you use a model like that and you actually, you know, you're encouraging autonomy, you're encouraging, you know, kind of leadership and decision making, and, you know, you're getting kids involved. Universal design for learning. I mean, there's a lot of things that we can do that will empower all kids, and then ultimately shift away from, you know, because when you're empowering all kids, when you're providing this environment that is improving outcomes for everybody involved, like you're going to be reducing, you know, the stress behavior that we were seeing in the classroom before. You're going to be, you know, really making a positive difference. But I think it's hard. I mean, it's hard when you have been doing things a certain way, and change is difficult. Change is difficult. And
like change.
Yeah.
Systems don't like change, but I'm like, systems don't like change. They don't.
Systems are resistant to change, right?
Yes.
And you know, I mean, I look at these things often, and you know, I know how difficult it can be, and sometimes, you know, it's easy to kind of look and blame people, but it's often the broken system that's really the problem. It's not the individual on the other side of the table. It's often that they're in a system that's broken. And, you know, again, I mean, you know, I think, you know, other things that are important about, you know, kind of the IEP process is like, you know, try to collaborate, make, you know, I had some really tough IEP meetings, but I'll tell you, my goal was always to collaborate. My goal was to try to work with them, not to, you know, but it's hard. It's hard. And, you know, when, there's probably not much harder than an IEP team meeting for a parent. You know, I think about going in there, and as a parent, you're listening to these reports that provide all this really dismal information about your child, this child that you love and that you brought into this world and that you care deeply about. That's a really tough position to be in. And, you know, it's hard not to get emotional, to get defensive, to get upset. But the more you can equip yourself, the more you can go in with a plan. I mean, I remember the district would, you know, have a draft IEP before our meeting. And I never really liked that, because I wanted the meeting to be the point of drafting the IEP. But I would go in with my own draft IEP. And that's what you can do with a resource like this. You can have your own goals with you and bring those. And when you bring something to the table like that, it really can help foster that collaboration.
And I like a draft IEP,
right?
Because I get to process it, and I get to say, here's my question. Now, if I go into an IEP meeting and you have a draft, I've had that happen with my kids where they're like, we're so sorry we didn't. But at this stage, we've been at the school for a while. We've collaborated for a while. So like, it's okay, because I know like 90% of what's in there we collaborated on, because we've already established that relationship. But I think you're absolutely right. There's so much importance to that, making it a collaborative process. And I think schools don't often realize that sometimes they are cutting off that collaboration from the beginning by saying like, this is when the meeting is, and this is when you're going to get this, and this is what's in there, and this is what, and the parents immediately, like, I've had parents where I'm like, oh, okay, so when you get a draft, well, I don't get drafts. Well, when the meeting is, well, they only do them on this date at this time. Like, and I'm like, I don't speak that language. So
federal law actually has a little something to say about that too, right?
Right. And I'm like, I don't speak that language. So I come in and I tend to disrupt the whole, like, parents will be like, I've never had so much collaboration. I've never gone to draft. I've never had a meeting not on a Friday at 2:00. Like, they're like, I've never experienced that. But to the statement that was made earlier too, I just want to say about like it not being fair for the learners, right? Like how they'll say that. And I always say, here's the thing. If we actually educated non-disabled learners the way we educate disabled learners on non-disabled learners, then you wouldn't have to have a discussion about fair, because there would be a discussion about how one learner may need something different from the other to access. But it's just me.
Right. No. Well, on that, we are just about at the end here, but I want to give you an opportunity before we end, if there's anything that you'd like to share, anything that you got coming up, or where people can find you and learn more about your work. I know a lot of people in our community probably already follow you on social media. You've got a really valuable feed there. So where might people follow you, or are there things you want to share with us before we wrap up here?
Yeah, and you guys, shout out to you all. You all are really good. Like, I see my stuff shared on your page, so I love that. They can find me at destinyhuffconsulting.com. I have a free 20-minute consult. I'm also on Instagram at DestinyHuff_IEP_advocate. I'm on Facebook at Destiny Huff Consulting. I co-host a podcast with my friend Lisa Baskin-Wright called the Affirming Village Podcast, where we talk about all the neuroaffirming things and practices and how to implement that. And we bring that collaborative piece of that. I'm a mental health therapist, advocate, mother of neurodivergent learners still in school, and Lisa is a educator, advocate, and her children are both graduated out of school, and I'm Black and she's white, and so we have a lot of conversations about advocacy from all those different intersectionalities and pieces. And then the last thing I guess I'm going to share, because I'm in the end stages of it, is first, my Neuroaffirming IEP Summit is in September. And so I do that in the fall and the spring. Guy will be speaking in the spring, but we have it coming up in the fall. I handpick my speakers. I make sure they're neuroaffirming, make sure they're coming from that approach. And they do a 45-minute to an hour live or pre-recorded or panel interview style, and talk about different things. So I have different topics. You can go to my website or that link to access that. And then the last one I was going to share is that I'm in the end of wrapping up and finalizing my second book, which is called The Language of IEPs. That is, and so it's going to be a neuroaffirming view on language of IEPs. So whereas this one, I kind of was like, oh, this is special education, this is this and that. This book is really going to get into the language of each section of an IEP, how to write that, how we have to be mindful of ableism and intersectionality. So I'm really excited for that one.
Well, I'm excited too. Do you have a release date yet, or
do not have a release date yet, because I'm still doing some editing and tweaking to see when I want to release it, but we'll definitely let you know. I finally did my appendix section today.
Gotcha.
So and it's going to come along.
Well, let us know, and will there be a paper copy as well?
There will, and it'll be like this one will be like an actual paperback book style instead of spiral, but I'll have a digital download for appendices where you can actually edit the templates that I'm going to have. So I'm going to have a checklist in there, and I'm going to have a parent input template that you can download and edit too. So
love it. Well, once you have that out, let me know, and we'll get you back on the podcast to talk about that book, because I love and appreciate the work that you're doing, and I think it's so important, and we really make an effort here to try to amplify the work that's being done out there that we think is really worth sharing, and your work is fantastic. We had one final comment here. Sarah said, I gave your name to my CSE chairperson. So that's good. And just to clarify here, you still, so, in addition to the book, if somebody wants to hire you as an advocate, are you still available for individual work
Yeah.
as well? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay,
So you
great.
can go on my website. I have a consultation form.
Okay.
And we set up a 20-minute consultation.
Okay.
It's free.
Okay.
But yeah, I still sit at IEP tables and 504 tables for at least the foreseeable future.
Gotcha.
It's getting rough out there.
Okay. Yeah, no. I appreciate that. And it's good. I mean, it's good. I mean, and again, I mean, you provided a really rich resource here for parents, but sometimes you do. Sometimes you need to tap out. Sometimes you need to bring in another voice. And that other voice may be saying the same thing you're saying, but sometimes it just, it helps to have somebody else sometimes bringing the message. And it's good to know that you're out there doing that. So we're going to go ahead and wrap up. I'm going to ask you to stick around for 1 second, Destiny. So we're going to say goodbye to everybody here. I want to thank everybody for joining us today for the podcast. Encourage you, if you find this valuable, share it. We put it out there, and we really want you to share these things. Sarah mentioned a minute ago, you share it with people at your school or your district. Share it with other families that you work with. That's how we spread the word and help people to, support their children and make positive changes. So again, thank you for being here with us today. I think we're back next week as well. Dr. Destiny Huff, thank you. You're an incredible person. I really, truly appreciate you and this work that you're doing. I know that this kind of thing really makes a difference for families. And for me, this work is really driven by how do we make a difference for a kid that is on the wrong side of, punitive exclusionary discipline, that is not being supported, that's not being understood. So thank you for all that you do. And everyone else, we will see you again next time. Thanks again. Bye-bye.